Family and fellow soldiers, I'm the Professor, and this is the Moment of Truth. One of the things that a number of these leftists have figured out in the last couple of weeks, especially after the whole Charlie Kirk killing thing and the Democrats' completely and thoroughly compliant response to it, is that a lot of the support that they had thought they were going to be getting has been drying up. It hasn't dried up completely, but it's clearly a lot harder to get to than it's been in the past. And this goes triple for a whole lot of these tethers and these bootlicks, all of these folks who are waving foreign flags and thinking to themselves that was going to be their ticket to ride. The people who had been getting a free ride for the longest time, they're also noticing a lot of their would-be perks and privileges are starting to evaporate. Claiming to be the good black, as in the non-FBA black, that ain't a ticket to ride anymore. Let's be direct here. There's been a number of individuals who understood full well that as long as they were not considered to be one of us, they thought that they could get away with something. But these white supremacists were not fooled, and most of these people have not been getting paid big money. Sure, they're making better than what they were getting back home, but back home they weren't getting anything at all. So the core question then is, why would anyone go along with a system like that really isn't offering that much? We've underestimated that in addition to its other forms of mental enslavement, one of the prime things that white supremacy did was to successfully brand itself as basically being the only road to importance. Social status matters to people far more than economic status, believe it or not. How are you seen and looked at in the eyes of other people? To a lot of folks, that carries a lot more weight than what's in their bank account. That's the prime reason why you got so many of these black athletes and entertainers and such acting like a bunch of $40 million slaves. They should have financial independence and security, and yet they show themselves to be slavishly dependent on the approval of white society. Now, what does that tell you? The psychic benefits of white supremacy matter a lot more than the tangible benefits for a lot of people. That's the invisible hold that it's got on them. No ruling elite can rule for long without the use of operatives, auxiliaries, and buffer groups. The elite can't do all the dirt themselves, mainly because they don't have the numbers to do it with. What they have to do is to get other people to get out front and be their crash dummies for them and do their dirty work. That's where psychic benefits come in. When Europe was in the Dark Ages, it degenerated further than it already began into feudalism, and they never actually came out of it. Now, feudalism was what gave rise to the so-called kings of Europe, who themselves were actually just tribal savages who had learned from the Romans how to build stone forts, because that's the only real difference between the so-called kings in Europe and the rest of the pagans who were living out in the woods painting themselves blue. Now, as kings, quote-unquote, they were simply too weak or too old, or in many cases just too diseased to call themselves laying down the law themselves. That part about disease is important because although you won't see it in the period pieces that the white media puts in their TV shows and movies, these royal families often had all kinds of diseases and STDs, and because they were all committing habitual nonstop incest, they all had some kinds of genetic defects and genetic aberrations. This is why so many of their kings were so predisposed to unbelievable violence and immorality. Those Neanderthal genes certainly didn't help, and they also had so many kings who were insane. A number of diseases, if left untreated, will cause mental impairment and cognitive decline, like King George of Britain, for example. So the kings in their stone forts would use their own ill-gotten gains in order to put together a group of hired thugs that they called the Palace Guard. These were the guys who would go outside of the castle, and whatever unfortunate people happened to live around the king's stone fort, the serfs, these thugs would come up and say, you got to give the king his cut of whatever you got. Whatever you produce, whatever money you have, you got to give it to the king for free. And in return, you won't be killed. That's what the actual benefit was for them. You just won't die. Within time, as the Moors from Africa brought civilization to Europe, at least the teachings, which clearly didn't stick, the Europeans emerged from the Dark Ages, and they began to invade everywhere else. The warlords in Europe had no real resources of their own, and they also had hordes of their own impoverished peasants who didn't have much of anything either. When the Europeans began their genocidal expansion, they sent out their undesirables first, of which they had no lack. They sent out their criminals, their debtors, their criminals, their political dissenters, their criminals, their religious heretics, their criminals. Did I say they sent out their criminals? This is who they called their colonists, the flotsam and jetsam of feudal Europe. It's like when they would claim that Europeans went into Asia to do trade, quote-unquote. The Europeans had no agriculture, no industry, no skilled craftsmen, no food, no resources, no skills. They had absolutely nothing to trade with Asia. That's the reason why whenever they talk about people like Marco Polo, all they're able to talk about is what Marco Polo brought from Asia. They never talk about what he took to Asia because he didn't have anything to take. And it was Asia that gave the Europeans gunpowder. Gunpowder, however, is what gave the Europeans the world. You need to understand that the love affair that these white supremacists have with firearms in specific is a deeply ingrained cultural dependence. Gunpowder is easily made, easy to transport, and can be used immediately anywhere. So for these white supremacists, they have a religious fixation on firearms, and that's not an exaggeration. It holds a spiritual place in their psychological cosmology precisely because of the fact that gunpowder was the only thing that made it where they could actually get out of Europe and didn't have to go back. Before the advent of gunpowder, every single fight that the Europeans had tried to wage outside of Europe, they lost, and lost big. Gunpowder was what changed all of that. And as a result, Europe went from what Dr. John Henrik Clarke accurately described as a thawed-out icebox to actually being a place that hoarded much of the world's wealth. Now, in time, as the Europeans' genocidal march across the globe expanded, they created an international structure that resembled what they were doing locally in Europe. You would have, as Dr. John Henrik Clarke called it, their homes and their outposts. So, just as in Europe, they would have in the New World so-called colonists who would be set up as a de facto castle guard. They were the main ones carrying out the violence on behalf of the white ruling class. The same thing would happen on the plantations, with the overseer's job being to use violence to keep the unruly slaves from revolting. But white supremacy is all about greed and murder. It's a covenant of theft, but there's no honor among thieves. So in the end, white power has no permanent plans for any of its tools, even the white ones. And that's the reason why it uses psychic benefits to keep them on board, because in the end, it doesn't want to actually have to give any tangible benefits, because tangible benefits are what empower people in the physical world. The first psychic benefit that white supremacy gives to its tools is to tell them they're special, that they're better than, well, whomever it is that they're being sent out to attack. And that talking point about this or that select group or person being better than, that goes double for immigrants. After all, if you got people who just stepped off a boat yesterday, how are you going to sell them the lie that they're better than anyone? They didn't have a penny to their name and have no accomplishments. That's the reason why you have to have a permanent underclass inside the population, which is what they selected us to be. And as far as telling anybody that they're better than anyone else, that goes only if they can successfully kill enough of the other people to force them to surrender and live in subjugation. That's taken as proof of white supremacy's superiority and of its subgroups. But as Neely Fuller said, white supremacy believes in taking both sides of the conversation. So in those instances where they've had groups who are simply too hard or simply too difficult to actually subjugate, if they just couldn't crack these guys, instead they say, well, those people over there, they're just a bunch of animals. They're subhumans, I tell you. They're savages. Yeah, because you couldn't overcome them. Though, as Lyndon Johnson said, if you can convince the lowest white man that he's better than the richest black man, then you won't have to steal his money. He'll gladly give you every penny he's got. That's psychic benefits. White society, the tethers, the silly Negroes chasing white acceptance, aka the good blacks, they all try to play the game of psychic benefits. Black athletes and celebrities are particularly susceptible to this, as are the Negroes who call themselves climbing the political ladder. Psychic benefits are key to perpetuating the power of a corrupt ruling elite because it doesn't cost them anything. And if the rulers find that people can be bought off with psychological masturbation and you can substitute that for the material benefits that you used to have to give them, then why would you go back to giving them tangible benefits? Why pay for the cow when you can keep milking that heifer for free? But understand something. Once somebody or a group has chosen to dance with the devil, just because the devil looks for a new dance partner doesn't mean that they're going to change. There's been some Negroes who have short memories or tiny brains, and they've already forgotten that people like, say, Candace Owens made a career out of attacking black people full time, and Tucker Carlson has done the same, becoming one of the most shameful yet shameless proponents of killing unarmed black citizens, and then killing white people who dare to stand in solidarity with racial justice. Remember, the only reason that Daniel Perry, who intentionally murdered a white BLM activist in Texas, is a free man today is because Tucker Carlson went on his TV show and told the governor of Texas that it would send the right kind behind a racial message if he pardoned that convicted murderer, and it would show that in Texas the white right isn't going to let any race soldiers rot in prison if they can do anything about it, laws be damned. And that reprehensible act is what led to Ben Shapiro trying to one-up Tucker by publicly demanding that Trump pardon Derek Chauvin's federal conviction. And Shapiro also reiterated the exact same rationale, that the 2020 uprisings and Chauvin's successful convictions were seen as a political defeat for the white right. They made no bones that white power had taken huge L's, and overturning what they knew to be lawful convictions would be their way of undoing those defeats. This is who Tucker Carlson is. His problem, no matter what he may tell you, isn't that he thinks that AIPAC has too much influence. His problem is he doesn't think he has enough, and he resents it. But his utter hatred for black people hasn't changed, and make no mistake, it's only because Tucker Carlson made some inroads with some guys in the Middle East and got some money from them. That's the reason why he's singing a somewhat different tune these days. But keep in mind, people like Jared Kushner, who's on the good side of AIPAC, have also been in the Middle East trying to make friends. Tucker Carlson's trying to position himself to be a major player in Middle Eastern affairs, particularly financial affairs. That's the reason why he's talking differently. The only reason that you see people like Candace Owens and Tucker Carlson talking differently now is because they recognize that there's a generational shift that's taken place. People like Tucker and Candace and Charlie Kirk came on the scene because they were looking for someone who would pay them to spew their anti-black filth. And unfortunately, under white supremacy, there's plenty of people who would do that. But things are changing, at least as far as where the low-hanging fruit may be located for that kind of hustle. The boomers were very religious, far more religious than any generation after them, and as a result, white evangelicals looked at Israel as adjacent to their white Christian nationalism, and black boomer Christians looked at Israel as adjacent to their dreams of white acceptance. And both the white boomer Christians and the black ones were motivated by the idea that what they were doing on earth would be storing up riches in heaven. People like Netanyahu gladly played on that. That's the reason why both the white and black boomers were all so hot and bothered over Israel, and it made their hearts go pitter-pat. They were both willing to accept psychic benefits. Meanwhile, people like Netanyahu and others have been getting real money and real weapons. Tangible benefits. Well, Generation X is built different. And so are the millennials, and even Gen Z, who is hardest of all, it seems. The boomers' core flaw was that they tried to live in their own imaginations. They were the single most aspirational generation who's ever lived. So they were only too happy to be living vicariously through singers, athletes, entertainers, or whatever famous black first had been elected to this or that office. Well, famous black first has nothing to do with being black first. For practically all of living memory, it's been one way when it comes to these kind of dynamics. And while there will always be some people with big money who are willing to spend it for Israel, they won't have total control. Their threats to get people knocked off the air will become weaker and weaker, as will their ability to control who gets funds and who doesn't. With the international community making noise about Gaza, that makes it where the typical AIPAC-backed entities over there aren't as welcome as they had been just a few years ago. So you have people like Tucker Carlson who see these changes and recognize that there's some money that they could get for themselves if they work things the right way. That's the game that's going on here. A change in rhetoric doesn't change what someone is, and if that's all it takes to make you look at an anti-black racist differently, then you have fallen for psychic benefits. You want to give someone your real attention and real credibility when all they're giving you is phony lip service. These people are still playing an angle, they always are. And while some of you may think it matters because what they say on this one issue lines up with what you believe, just remember, these people are the reason that the country's so polarized. It's either black or white, this or that. They're the reason why when it comes to any sort of political discussion, everything is seen as all or nothing. They're the reason for that. So it's not like they can change their stance just a little bit. It's got to be either arm Israel to the teeth or defund Zionism entirely. Charlie Kirk tried to tiptoe away, and his Israeli backers let him know that anything less than 100% slavish devotion would be seen as 100% betrayal. They didn't give him all that money because they liked him. They did it because he was a convenient tool and empty vessel who they thought was dependable. And the moment he proved even marginally defective, they showed that they were fully willing to cut him off and find someone more reliable. This is the reason why it's so important that we remain on our square. What we do actually has effects far outside of our community, mainly because we're the ones who everybody's standing on the shoulders of. And that being the case, when we decide that we're going to start agitating and we're going to start causing a fuss, that's going to shake everything above us. But we cannot and will not tolerate being on the bottom. That's the entire reason why we're doing what we're doing. And yes, you're going to have a whole lot of people who have been eating good off of the old order, off of the way that things were. And these people are going to be finding out that all of those benefits that they thought that they had, what few crumbs they thought they were getting, are not going to be offered anymore. And what they're also going to find is the pat on the head, that's going to be disappearing too. And these same individuals are going to suddenly realize, gee, there seems to be a lot of racism on the so-called left, just as we've always recognized on the so-called right. And they'll blame systemic racism, and they'll also blame troublemakers like us in the black grassroots, but the reality is the people they should be blaming are themselves. For centuries now, there's been tons of people who have been trying to find a comfortable place under white supremacy, and the reality is, at least for a while, white supremacy could create the illusion that it did have such a place for them. They could go ahead and get a few tangible benefits, but mostly it was going to be psychological ones, and the main psychological benefit would be that they would be told that they were better than us. And for a lot of people, that was more than enough for them to risk life and limb and give every little penny that they didn't have. But it's not good enough for us. We saw through the game a long time ago, but it took time before we had some generations who were finally ready to go ahead and shrug off all of those old, dead, decrepit, false ideas that too many prior generations had clung to. Psychic benefits are as bogus as an IOU. We're not settling for psychic anything. It's going to be tangible, it's going to be real, it's going to be something that we can put in our bank accounts, or it's worthless. We in the black grassroots have never accepted psychic anything. And now we're to the point where we've got just enough black folks who are on code where we can show these people, like Kamala Harris and others, that if you come up to us trying to offer psychic benefits, then the only thing we're going to offer you will be real consequences. Good day. And be one. I'd like to take a moment to mention some of our contributors: Charles Hairston, Richard Mitchell, Jack Smith, Charles Thompson, and Gregory Kimball. Salute to them and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black empowerment only exists because of you.